Thank you. Yeah. So I'll share my screen. Oops. Do you see the slides now? Yeah. Good. Okay, then let's get started. So as I said, my main affiliation with the Department of Human Geography in Lund. So I am sort of an economic geographer in my background, and I have sort of a starting point in my research previously, at least in more sort of geographical versions of innovation systems research. So regional innovation systems and national innovation systems. But have in recent years been working with technological innovation systems as well. So I guess you can sort of consider this as a lecture given by someone who is more of an expert user rather than someone who has actually developed this concept, right? So I'll try to reflect on how I've used the framework and also maybe perhaps put it a bit more into bigger context when we talk about transition studies. So that's sort of the aim of the lecture here in the next 45 minutes. So what I hope to cover is one, placing TIS in sort of a greater context, two, a section on how to actually do a TIS analysis, and then thirdly, some reflections on TIS policy or policy recommendations based on use of TIS versus sort of the greater field of transformative innovation policy, right, which has been developing in recent years and which is very closely connected to sustainability transitions. So sort of reflecting a bit on the relation between those two. So that's the outline of the next 45 minutes or so. So the concept of innovation systems. So an innovation system should be understood as a network of actors working under a given institutional framework with a focus on developing and diffusion of innovations. Right? So it really emphasizes innovation as a systemic process with collaborations and interactions between many different types of actors being important. And innovation system research talks about these different structural components. There's three structural components that make up an innovation system: actors, networks between them, and then the institutions that govern or influence their actions. So an innovation system approach encompasses sort of, or acknowledges the importance of multiple types of actors, as you can see in the list here, and also in the figure here from Kuhlmann et al. From 2001. Right? It also covers different parts of systems, both the ones that sort of develop the technologies, but also ones that actually use them in real life. Yeah. Just want to highlight this book, as you see in the top right corner, recently published by Benoit Gaudin, about models of innovation, which I think is a very nice book that sort of gives a detailed introduction to how different models of innovations have been developed. So from the linear model to the more systemic perspective, and also how they interact. The story behind those models of innovation turns out to be a lot more complicated than what you actually often read about in individual papers around using innovation systems. So we can talk about an innovation systems family here, yeah, with different family members in it. So we have the national innovation systems, developed particularly by Bindo Lundvall, Chris Freeman, etc. Regional innovation systems, Phil Cook, Björn Aschheim, sectorial innovation systems, Franco Malerba, and then technological innovation systems that we'll talk about today, which is where the name sort of, maps geographically, in particular on two different locations, one around sort of West Sweden, particularly around Gothenburg, Chalmers, and the other one in the Netherlands, particularly related to people who have been employed at Utrecht University for some time. So all these different sort of family members here, they share the view of innovation as a systemic process. And they also more or less share the understanding of what actually constitutes the structural elements of innovation systems. So we have some differences here. Malerba, for example, also talks about knowledge and technology as a structural element. And there are other authors that also consider infrastructures as a structural element as well. But actors, networks, and institutions are sort of seen as structural elements across those different approaches. The core difference then, of course, is the object of analysis and consequently where the boundary is drawn around the system. So it depends a bit on what we are interested in understanding here. Is it sort of the innovation capacity of actors that are located in a specific country or region? Or is it in a relation to a specific sector or in connection to a specific technology? So when we talk about technological innovation systems, sort of the generally used definition is from Bo Carlson and Richard Stankiewicz, a paper from 1991, where they talk about technological innovation systems as networks of agents interacting in a specific economic or industrial area under a particular institutional infrastructure or set of infrastructures and involved in the generation, diffusion, and utilization of technology. I'll just make a few comments on the relation here to the other innovation system family members here. So as you can see from this definition here, there's no sort of a priori assumptions around the geography of TISs. Right? This depends on the flows, which basically means the relations between the actors that are interacting in the technology development and diffusion. In terms of sectors, then most sectors rely on multiple technologies. And at the same time, technologies are most often used in more than one sector. So when it comes to the relation between technological innovation systems and sectorial innovation systems, one cannot say that the other, one or the other is necessarily embedded in each other. So I know that Lois already showed this figure this morning here, sort of that's then the second family we can talk about that technological innovation systems is part of here, the sustainability transitions family, right? Where the main family members are transition management, strategic niche management, the multi-level perspective, and then technological innovation systems. So why is technological innovation system then part of this club or family of sustainability transition theories? Well, firstly, because emergence and maturation of new technologies is a central process in socio-technical transitions. And empirically, we see that TIS studies focus on studying the development of radical innovations, which are more environmentally sustainable than existing competing technologies. However, from the point of departure, the TIS framework is arguably quite agnostic about the technologies in focus, and it can equally well be used to study technological development of heavily polluting technologies or very well established technologies or technologies where the environmental sustainability effects are not at all clear or they're simply not in focus. So in a sense, the membership of this family here is more a result of the application of the framework on radical green technologies. So in my opinion, the greatest contribution of the TIS literature is its conceptualization of innovation system processes or functions, as they are generally called in this literature. So while the innovation systems literature has in general been criticized for being too static, a core contribution of the TIS framework has been to put focus on the performance of innovation systems and its ability to deliver a number of key functions. At least partly, this development is motivated by the ambition of providing sound policy advice. There are simply limits to how elaborated policy advice one can provide based on an analysis of the structural components of an innovation system. Now, focusing on TIS functions also opens up for analyzing not just how the structure of the innovation system develops over time, but also how the ability to deliver these functions changes. Now, if you read the Berg et al. 2008 paper on the reading list, you'll know that the functions in this paper are empirically defined, right? So they basically come from readings of existing literatures on which have sort of a systemic element, right? So innovation systems, large technical systems, clusters, etc. And then the authors then identify what was actually taking place in these systems. What were the key processes that were going on, right? And that led to this list of functions. This also implies that there can be different readings of what the key functions actually are. So this two most frequently used starting points are the papers by Berg et al. And Heckert et al. 2007, which overlap to quite a large extent. We'll get back to that in a bit. But there are other as well, including the one by Christina Chaminade and Charles Edquist, which is, however, not specific to technological innovation systems. So how do one actually goes about doing a TIS analysis? Yeah, I'm going to try to cover this based on two different sources. One is sort of my own empirical experience from work with colleagues in Norway and Sweden around TIS analysis, different sectoral context, and then it's based on particularly this work by Anna Berger, Manual för funktionsanalys in Swedish, which is basically a manual for carrying out a functional analysis, which is a more elaborated version of what you also find in the 2008 paper. Right? And you'll find also that the Utrecht version of the technological innovation systems, they also have a manual, which in many ways is similar to the approach that's being developed by what we can call the West Sweden group here. So the first point is to define the boundaries of the innovation system here. So firstly, this is about considering what is the technology in focus, right? So how broad or how narrow is the focus? Are we talking about a general purpose technology, or are we talking about a very specific application here? Then there's a question of the parts of the value chain that needs to be included. So the general answer, I think, is that one should include the parts that are important for the innovation dynamics relating to the technology. This is maybe quite easy to say, but that can be quite difficult to actually assess in reality when you do empirical work. And this also points a bit to the need for adjustments along the way, right? So you might start a TIS analysis thinking that we'll focus on those parts of the value chain, and then as you get wiser along the way, you realize that there are actually other parts that matter significantly for the innovation dynamics around this technology, and that you therefore need to include them as well. Just give you one example from this report you see in the bottom right corner here, which is a report from a project on green transitions in the maritime shipping sector, where we look at 4 different technologies: biogas, biodiesel, hydrogen, and battery electric solutions. So in this case here, it turned out that the upstream part was extremely important for understanding the development of these technologies in this application domain, being maritime shipping, right? So basically, in order to understand the innovation dynamics around the use of, for instance, biodiesel in the maritime shipping sector, understanding biomass production actually turned out to be very important, which is perhaps not self-evident from the beginning. Another option in terms of defining value chains is to start from prospective value chains. So basically, value chains that are imagined or envisioned, if you want. So in this paper here, we use the TIS approach to assess the opportunities for establishing hydrogen direct reduction in steelmaking, which is currently underway in Sweden. So here we use TIS in sort of a backcasting manner, where we know very clearly the envisioned future system, and TIS is then used to assess the potential for actually establishing this system by looking also at, of course, how the system is performing today along the different functions. And then the final boundary that needs to be defined is, of course, the question of geography, right? So as Lars has pointed out in a critique of the TIS literature, it suffers from a tendency to methodological nationalism, so more or less automatically taking the national scale as the starting point. However, as mentioned before, the TIS approach is originally sort of agnostic about geography. So ideally, one will follow the innovation network where it takes you. However, of course, there might be practical limitations to this approach. And also research funders often implicitly strengthen this sort of methodological nationalism by giving preference to projects that have a specific focus on a certain geographical area. Step 2 is then an analysis of structural components. Yeah. So you remember the figure from this Kuhlmann et al. Paper that was one of the previous slides. So this is then the background for this mapping of actors that matters for the development of the steel technological innovation systems in relation to hydrogen steel. So this is simply a mapping exercise of the different actors, and of course also of the networks between them. And here there can be many different ways of understanding networks between actors, of course. This is one example where we use patent data to develop or to sort of visualize the different networks. From the maritime case, we also do an analysis of participation in R&D projects funded by the European Union or the European Commission over quite a long period in order to understand which actors are actually central in these innovation networks, which are peripheral, and also how do they change over time. The analysis of structural components allows for an assessment of the maturity level of the technology. Yeah? So based on our knowledge on the number and capabilities of actors, yeah, we can sort of assess whether we are analyzing what we call a nascent, an emerging, or mature test. Yeah? However, this says actually quite little about the actual processes that happens in the technological innovation system. We can, for instance, think about a very mature technological innovation system where the actors are locked into fixed ways of thinking and well-established collaboration patterns, which basically stifles innovation. And this is where functional analysis adds to our understanding of innovation systems. So, performing a functional analysis implies analyzing and assessing the ability of the innovation system to deliver the core processes that are needed to stimulate innovation. So this table here is from a recent review on the test literature by Anna Bergek, where she compares the functions in the West Sweden and the Utrecht versions of the TIS framework. And as you can see, the differences are, if not marginal, then at least not very major. Right? So knowledge development and diffusion is one function in Bergek et al., while Heckert et al. Splits it up into two. When it comes to entrepreneurial experimentation or entrepreneurial activities, then both the names here basically stress entrepreneurs. Right? But the core aspect of this function here is not sort of the entrepreneurship part, if you want. So it's not about establishing new firms, but it's rather about the experimenting part. So the core point here is that there is a need for testing out new technologies, business models, strategies, etc. And actually both of these contributions here, they highlight that this can take place in newly established firms, but also very much through reorientation by incumbents, as we'll talk more about in the lecture tomorrow. Guidance or direction of search refers to the establishment of clear incentives for actors to join the TIS, but also for choosing directions within the TIS, for example, between different technology options or different types of business models. So here it's worth noticing that the Utrecht version emphasizes choices by technology users, while the West Sweden version does not sort of single out any specific types of actors. So influence on the direction of search is, for instance, also concerned with incentives for technology suppliers to enter a TIS. The processes concerned with developing markets, creating legitimacy, and mobilizing resources for the technology are described in quite similar ways in the two approaches. And then finally, Bergek includes a category in development of positive externalities, which basically refers to aspects such as a common pool of skilled labor, development of specialized intermediaries, or the establishment of technology-specific infrastructures. So these are all the functions that needs to be assessed, right? And then of course there's a question of how to do this empirically. Well, the clearest answer is maybe to say that one can use all sorts of types of available information that may inform a functional assessment. Right? So in our paper on steel, we sort of distill a list of potential indicators from the original Berg et al. Paper, and it includes a lot of different types of information that you might access through very different techniques. So in this way, there's not a very specific method associated with TIS analysis, but I would say that it is difficult to get sufficient data on some of these functions, for instance, influence on the direction of search, without qualitative fieldwork, right? Be it interviews or be it other types of methods. So in our report here on maritime shipping, just sort of briefly say what we used here. So we did a lot of interviews, right, with actors throughout the value chain, observation at events and conferences, literature review and document studies. This was actually very important, in particular regarding access to data on the development of market volumes for different segments. Data on financial support, which covered both data on support awarded by public support agencies, such as the Research Council of Norway or the Innovation Agency, but also data on private investments and joint ventures. Then we did a patent analysis on green fuels and maritime technologies based on data from the European Patent Office PatStat database. We did a bibliographical analysis on the same topic based on data from ISI Web of Knowledge and Science Citation Index Expanded. And then we did an analysis also on research data on international R&D collaborations using the CODIS database, which contains information on all EU-funded R&D projects. We were covering all projects from the 5th framework period to the 6th to 7th and Horizon 2020. So based on the functional analysis, one can then identify blocking or inducement mechanisms for the development of the technological innovation system. So this is the last step before discussing policy implications of the study. And the sort of intuitive approach here is often to focus on the weakest performing functions relative to some kind of benchmark, which might, for instance, be competing technologies. However, identifying blocking and inducement mechanisms also requires attention to the interactions between functions. So basically how they influence each other. So here the work of Walsurs on motors of innovation suggests that there can be different drivers of overall TIS functionality improvement. So improving weakly performing functions may also be achieved through intervening elsewhere. Right? So essentially, this is what these figures here suggest. They depict two different motors, the science and technology push motor and the system building motor, which starts from respectively resource mobilization and entrepreneurial activity, but then influences a wider sets of functions. This point here has also been made in a slightly different form by Hans Helsmarks and colleagues, who suggest that supporting innovation system strength can also be used to address weaknesses. And then the final step is to draw out policy recommendations. So I'll get back to this topic in just a second, but here I'll simply note that interactions with policymakers have in general been quite high on the agenda for TIS scholars. That's also illustrated by this paper here by Anna Wieczorek and Marco Heckert. On the other side of the table, the TIS framework offers sufficiently clear and understandable policy recommendations to get policymakers interested. So to exemplify, the Swedish Energy Agency commissioned a report a few years ago, which was essentially a TIS study of 5 different technologies related to renewable energy. In terms of critiques towards the TIS approach, then this paper here was also on the reading list for the lecture today. And I think this is a very good paper actually, because the authors here, who are all sort of TIS prominent TIS scholars, engages in, I would say, very constructive ways with the core points of critique. So I'll simply very quickly go through these points of critiques before then ending with discussing the sixth point in a bit more detail. So the first point of critique focuses on how TIS studies tend to treat TIS development as an endogenous process, while different contextual factors may be crucial for TIS development. So this point of critique has been addressed conceptually in a paper in the same special issue, but also empirically, in particular by researchers at the TIC Center at the University of Oslo, such as, for instance, Tuka Mektika, who's been analyzing TIS context interactions in different ways. Secondly, as we discussed earlier, boundary setting is often quite difficult and decisions are poorly described in many TIS studies. Thirdly, lack of attention to geography. Now this relates both to the contextual issue raised above and also to this point about methodological nationalism we also discussed earlier. So basically lack of attention to how TIS development happens at and across different spatial scales. The fourth issue relates to whether TIS is actually a useful conceptual starting point for studying transitions. So here, core point is that TIS studies have very much focused on emerging technologies, but when we talk about transitions, then it is at least equally important to understand development of established incumbent technologies. And quite few TIS studies have considered this so far. And we'll get back to one of them tomorrow in the lecture on incumbents. The fifth point is then concerned with lack of attention to politics in TIS research. And the final point suggests that TIS research may provide better policy recommendations if it was more clear on the normative starting points and attempted to formulate more specific policy recommendations. So in the final part of this lecture, I'll connect to this debate by trying to sort of juxtapose the policy approach of TIS with the literature on transformative innovation policy. So this article here, I believe, is not on the reading list, but might be familiar to many of you anyway. Johan Scott and Ed Steinmüller, 3 Frames for Innovation Policy, which was published 2 years ago in Research Policy. So what Scott and Steinmüller do in this paper is basically that they single out 3 different generations of innovation policy. The first one here, generation 1, which is very much about technology push, very much focused on individual organizations, or at least a narrow range of organizations, in particular large firms, universities, and research institutes. In the second frame, which then relates to innovation systems, policy sort of recognizes that innovation is a systemic process, and in order to support innovation, there's a need to take a systemic perspective then. In both of these frames here, innovation is sort of, according to Scott and Steinmüller, not very highly sort of problematized, right? And that changes very much in the third frame here when we talk about transformative change. So then innovation policy is firstly concerned not with sort of individual single and in particular incremental innovations, but more with stimulating changes in socio-technical systems. And this point about ensuring that these changes are actually in a favorable direction for society at large becomes truly important. So I think this paper here is very nice. It's very useful. It sort of very clearly points to different generations of innovation policy. However, should also be taken with maybe just a pinch of salt. In particular, this critique by Elisa Giuliani in the same issue of Research Policy, where she argues that there is sort of an overemphasis on the differences between the different generations of innovation policy in this framework is worth taking into account. And I also, together with some very brilliant colleagues in Lund, have a book chapter coming out next year where we try to give a more balanced account of how small or big the differences are between these different generations of innovation policy. But nevertheless, it is a highly useful paper in many ways. Now, Perhaps the most useful, I don't want, not necessarily the most useful, but probably, in my opinion, the most influential paper that has been written around transformative innovation policy is this paper here by Matthias Weber and Harald Ruchacher from 2012, where they talk about different transformative system failures or challenges, as I would like to call them, which innovation policy should focus on when dealing with this sort of third generation innovation policy for transformative change. And the first of these challenges relates to directionality. So Weber and Ruchacher, they define directionality as pointing to the necessity not just to generate innovations as effectively and efficiently as possible, but also to contribute to a particular direction of transformative change. Okay, so the point here is that innovations are not by definition desirable, and innovation policy should stimulate those innovations that are desirable and not the other ones. So essentially it asks the question, is it really good that we invest in becoming better of getting oil and gas out of the ground, but not just when it comes to sort of technical innovations, but also very much organizational innovations or business model innovations can have negative effects, right? So think about planned obsolescence, right? That might be good for the profits of certain companies, but for society as a whole is probably not very beneficial in many ways. Similar with financial innovations, collateralized debt obligations, for example, turned out to be a pretty bad idea, being a key factor behind the 2007-2008 financial crisis. So how does one go about ensuring directionality in innovation policy? Well, here Weber and Ruchacher, they talk about the importance of establishing visions, and they also talk about the importance of implementing policy instruments in line with the visions. So, being Danish, I try to get figures or pictures of Lego figures into most of my lectures, and so this is the one in this lecture here. And the point of this slide here with the graph as well on your right hand is to sort of try to problematize a bit this directionality without sort of questioning in any way that this is absolutely fundamental to transformative innovation policy. It is at least worth acknowledging that very often setting direction is a truly difficult exercise, right? So what the graph here sort of illustrate in one way or another is our issue we have with the use of plastics or misuse of plastics in the world today. Obviously, this has really hit the media and the general public in the last 2, 3, 4 years or so. Now, the point about including this plastic example is that we have a number of different potential pathways forward when we talk about a transition to a sustainable plastic system. Plastics can be bio-based, it can be biodegradable, we can become better at recycling, we can use fewer types of plastics, or we can simply use less of plastics. Now, the issue here, as good colleagues in Lund has pointed out in a publication 2 years ago, is that none of these pathways forward have only sort of positive aspects to them. There are also significant challenges associated with each of these pathways. Plus, they do not always go well together hand in hand. So following one pathway might exclude another one for being followed. So this is simply to highlight that this process of setting direction can very often be extremely difficult. And it's not really clear always in all empirical contexts what is the right way forward. The second key challenge is about experimentation, right? So this points to the need to test new technologies, not only in terms of laboratory tests and establishing demonstration plants, etc., but also tests around business models and the use of the technologies in practice. So the point here is really about reducing uncertainty, learning about factors that make niche technologies successful. So The term experimentation here is not used in a way that it's commonly used in English language as just trying something new, but it's more systematic, a test done in order to learn something or to discover if something works or is true, as defined by the Cambridge English Dictionary. The third key challenge is associated with demand articulation. This points basically to the fact that green technologies have to enter the market and diffuse throughout the market, throughout society, if they are to have any sort of impact. So these figures here show you the share of all car sales in two countries, Denmark and Norway, which are electric vehicles or hybrids. Yeah? So Denmark is sort of the bar chart and Norway is the line. So what you can see here is that in Denmark, we are now pushing right above 3%, whereas Norway is pushing towards 50%. Yeah? So obviously this points to the fact that when we talk about green technologies, right, policy intervention on the demand side is absolutely crucial. Right? Part of this simply because many new green technologies suffer from what Klaus Rennings calls the double externality problem. So green innovation also produces benefits for non-payers in the use of the technologies. So they produce not only externalities in the development of technologies, but also on the use side of them. I just want to highlight that demand articulation is not just about policies to ensure an uptake and diffusion of these technologies. It's also very much about learning about user needs. So one example here is relating to many smart home technologies, which have been rolled out in many countries in recent years, or beginning to be rolled out now. And one of the promises that these technologies most often make is not only that they will make life more convenient for people, but also that they will lead to increased energy efficiency. Now, what researchers coming from a more anthropological perspective show in analysis of smart home technologies is that they're very often being used in very different ways from what the engineers envisioned when they were sitting in the laboratories and the lab and developing these technologies. So they're being used in all kinds of different ways for purposes one could not imagine, including, for instance, surveillance of family members in terms of when they go to bed, when they turn off their computer, etc., etc. Because these technologies actually allow for these kind of things in some cases. So what does this mean? Well, it means firstly that we cannot be sure that these energy efficiency requirements are actually going to take, or energy efficiency promises are actually going to be fulfilled, because we don't know exactly how the technologies are being used. But of course, it might also delegitimize the technologies, right? If they are being used for very different purposes, which perhaps not everybody agrees upon, right? And eventually, that of course will also limit the diffusion of these technologies. So learning about user needs and the way that that technologies are used in practice is also very important when we talk about addressing demand articulation challenges. Then finally, last challenge is about policy learning and policy coordination. Right? So it's learning about when policies work or don't work, but it's also very much about when the consequences of policies are desirable or undesirable. Right? So policy reflexivity is also very important. I think it's worth stressing here that the role of the policymaker also comes with a greater responsibility when policies set a clear direction, right? So perhaps it's one can argue that it's more important to actually ensure societal benefits from innovation policy when it sets a very clear direction going in a particular way forward, rather than saying, oh, we're simply letting the innovation system we're trying to make the innovation system functions as well as possible, right? If policy very much, for instance, stimulate a transition towards a bioeconomy, you want to make sure that we don't have very negative consequences in terms of rising food prices or soil degradation, etc., etc. If policy very much stimulates diffusion of renewable energy technologies, while you want to make sure that that you're not just creating problems at the end of the use of these technologies, as pointing out in this this recent paper by some of our colleagues from DTU here in Copenhagen. Policy coordination emphasizes that transitions between socio-technical systems are complex. They affect many different policy areas. And because of that, breakdown of policy silos is essential. This, I would argue, is also the case when we talk about more traditional innovation system policies, but it is perhaps even more the case when we talk about socio-technical transitions and policies stimulating them, because they cover an even larger amount of different policy areas. So to end this lecture, I'll simply consider a bit here whether TIS analysis can inform transformative innovation policy. So we can start by considering directionality. Well, here the function or direction of search very clearly informs about how direction is being set, but it does not give a lot of attention to deciding on which directions should be set or should be chosen. I think it's also quite clear when you read this Marquardt et al. 2015 paper, so the response to the six criticisms, and that there is some skepticism towards integrating normativity and opinions about technologies and technology choices in TIS studies. That being said, the TIS framework actually constitutes part of the conceptual starting point. In this paper here, you'll see the top right-hand corner here by Paula Kivima and Florian Kern, which provides a very nice analysis of innovation policy mixes for sustainability transitions. So this kind of illustrates that the TIS framework may at least inform the analysis and development of transformative innovation policy and how direction can be set. In terms of experimentation, well, then this is central to the entrepreneurial experimentation function. However, in this recent review by Anna Bergek, she concludes that the empirical evidence related to this function is limited, since many authors, probably because of the label entrepreneurial, associated with entry or activities by small or new firms. So because of that, I think it's probably worth or fair to say that so far, TIS studies have provided quite limited attention to understand experimentation. In terms of demand articulation, then I think potentially TIS analysis can very much inform transformative innovation policy formulation in this aspect through explicit attention to market formation. However, again here, sort of the review by Anna is sort of slightly disappointing in its assessment of the insights that have been gained by TIS analysis when it comes to market formation. So here she says that they give a rather simplified account of market formation, consists primarily of sales and installation numbers and descriptions of the public policies that have been in place for the technologies in question. So as a whole, the TIS literature does not provide any detailed understanding of the market formation process. So there's, for instance, little focus on anticipating and learning about user needs and the practices of using these, around using these technologies. And then finally, when it comes to policy learning and coordination, I would say that it's probably fair to say that this is not in focus in TIS research. So there's quite limited attention to analyzing and informing policymaking processes as such. So just to conclude, can TIS analysis inform transformative innovation policy? So typical sort of academic answer, yes, but only to some degree, I would say. And the reasons for only to some degree is firstly around the limited attention to policymaking processes. So I think that there is an outstanding sort of, in both meanings of the word, both in sort of remaining, but also as exceptional, opportunity for connecting TIS with the literature on responsible research and innovation, which may in particular help to address issues related to directionality and reflexivity in policymaking. The second reason is then this discrepancy between the content of the functions in the conceptual TIS work and the ways that they are analyzed in empirical studies. Right? So I think more thorough analysis of TIS functions may actually improve the ability to inform transformative innovation policy. And then I'll simply end here by noting that should of course also be acknowledged that there are different rationales for public policy intervention, which are underlying transformative innovation policy and innovation policy based on TIS studies, right? So TIS studies, TIS policy, or TIS-derived policy recommendations are more focused on sort of traditional ideas about correcting system failures, so being a bit more reactive, versus a more agenda setting or activist state, for example, which has been advocated by, in particular, Mariana Mazzucato in recent years. So with that, I'll end. I don't know how we do things now, Lois, if we take a break immediately or what your plans are.
Thanks a lot, Thijs. That was very comprehensive. And you did really well with time too. We have a few minutes for immediate questions, I think, of clarification, etc., etc. And either raise your hand or just put your name in the chat box, please. Yeah, Amir?
Thank you so very much. Presentation. It was so informative and inspiring. I was wondering how the dynamics processes functions in TIS, in one TIS, be related, interacted, or coupled with dynamics in another TIS. Imagine you are studying one technology and another technology, and you are using two TISs for those.